Are we good? There we go. Hey, everybody, how's it going? Woo! Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to the organizers. This is incredible. Y'all have done an amazing job setting this up, so thank you so much. And so let's kick into it. I'm Paul Frazee. I'm the CTO at Bluesky. I have to apologize. I didn't have a whole lot of time to put my slides together, so I had to use AI to make them look prettier. Let me turn that on now. There we go. So maybe I'll turn that off. All right, where did we come from? Where will we go? Where did we come from at Proto? Alternate titles, some talks that I thought about giving, but I rejected ultimately. Reverse DNS notation is cool, actually. And it's just JSON and a Merkle search tree. All right, so I thought it would be a good idea to do a kind of a storytelling, context-setting sort of talk, not actually dissimilar from the one that Blaine just gave, but a little bit more zoomed out, trying to put a sort of point in time that we're in, give the story about how we got here, how the technology choices were informed, how we like to think about the AT protocol as we've been working on it throughout the past few years. So we're going to start with the background. 2000s, I'm going to call it the decade of lost standards. You did. You absolutely did. And there were some real bangers at the time. You got the Web 1.0. I marked 2004 as my point because that's actually right before people started saying the Web 2.0 started to become a thing, which was great actually in various ways. But it's an interesting demarcation into away from a kind of standards-oriented approach for all of the kind of behaviors and into just a VM environment that the Web 2.0 ended up becoming. You had email, RSS, XMPP, BitTorrent. It was a lot of great technologies. One of the things that I like to distinguish with these technologies is the difference between publishing and distribution because they all handle different parts of it. Some of them handle more than one. Publishing is the notion of can you get to some content upon request? That would be like a website. You go to the website and you can get it, and that's continues to be a nice independent layer in the ecosystem. Distribution is pushing content to an audience, which we'll talk more about in some detail because that's where things got a little bit screwy, but it is useful to categorize between the two. Web 1.0 and BitTorrent, I would call those publishing technologies. Email, RSS, and XMPP, they're not, RSS is pretty exclusively distribution. The other two, of course, handle other needs, but are useful for distribution whenever you're working on a technology or a product. So what happened? Two things, this and then this. Publishing, it didn't do terribly, but mobile definitely changed a lot about the web's dominance. The web was quite ascendant leading up to the period where the mobile came in. However, the responsive technologies, the UX paradigms didn't catch up terribly quickly when it came to mobile. And you also had, the application stack sadly did not stay with web technologies. So the web has now become primarily the desktop application paradigm for networked applications. And it's also still quite useful for information publishing, and it continues to occupy that role in mobile. For distribution, it went much worse. Social becomes the dominant platform for distribution. RSS did not adapt, and Google Reader closed in 2013. So distribution really failed to stay independent. It's interesting what ended up happening with the newsletters with Substack. I do give them a lot of credit for pushing forward on, hey, you know what, for newsletters, for like essentially blogs, email is actually a great open publishing system, and it's really great that that has happened. It has given people the ability to migrate between their providers and preserve their newsletter beyond an individual provider. But email is really not great for paradigms other than, essentially what RSS was trying to do, and RSS couldn't do social. Now, I think that there's an alternate history that could have happened here, which is that Google realizes they had the full suite of protocols that they could have just bound together to create this magnificent open social network called Google+. but they chose not to. It, it would have required evolving those technologies. They weren't ready to go at the time, but they had the resources, and I think that would have been nice to see. So the 2010s I call for at least the context of this talk, the decade of activist R&D. There were three tech trees that I was aware of at least. I'm sure there were quite a number of others. There are some jokes baked in here. I feel like I can make that joke about reinventing the wheel because P2P was my chosen tech tree. But blockchains, P2P, and federation are the three areas that I saw the most work happening in this kind of space of people trying to re-decentralize the web. Blockchains are quite literally, where the money went. The primary use cases, I would say, of blockchains are really payments and registries, not publishing, not distribution. They just don't have the performance characteristics for those things. So on the plus side, it certainly made the concept of decentralization mainstream, at least to some degree, for better or for worse in some ways. But at this point, I'm somewhat indifferent to them. You've just got cost, performance, and usability problems. If you find the right use case and the right technology and the right properties, then, great. But in general, I'm just not that keyed up on the topic. P2P, we had a number of essentially variations of BitTorrent, and actually I think you'll find a number of folks that worked on IPFS here today, and some of it actually made its way into the app protocol. You also had Secure Scuttlebutt and DAT. Those were two that I personally got involved in. So they were designed for publishing and distribution. In fact, with P2P, like Secure Scuttlebutt was specifically a social network that was peer-to-peer. With IPFS and DAT, you can actually use it for subscribing to data streams and putting together little social networks, and we built a number of proof of concepts that way. It definitely helped advance the state of cryptographic data structures. The work that was done in the peer-to-peer world was really useful to us whenever the app proto was being implemented. And that is the world that we came from. We were all, for the most part, the initial team were in the peer-to-peer world in the technologies and the history that we had. What went wrong with P2P? Again, I feel like I can be harshest on it because it was the one that I was involved in. We had huge scale reliability and UX challenges. Things like, you have to get your devices paired. The projects I worked on only worked on desktop. It was sometimes quite difficult to make sure that for a given URL, you're going to reliably get the content at the pace that you need. But then kind of most importantly, scale was just not really possible for what we were trying to do. I made a number of social networks that were trying to work entirely on the device. And you just get a really small view of the world if you're just entirely on the device. Therapy session later. You also had some interesting things like because you're running daemons that are actively using more resources than the actual user, the usual application, you probably needed OS level support to actually manage that resource usage. That was something that I always found quite challenging. And then the programming model was hard. That is something I literally said at one point. It just can't be rocket science to implement a comments section, said in deep frustration. Federation. So there were multiple different projects through the 2010s in this world. Of course, you got the Diaspora, you got O-Status, which I believe GNU Social is the current name of that, and then Activity Pump, which gradually became Activity Pub. That's a good rename. Activity Pub becomes a W3C standard in 2018 and really kind of becomes the leading technology on this front. I would actually make the case that this is that alternate history that I described. At least in terms of the kind of mentality of how it's designed and the kind of mechanics of it, and the heritage. We'll talk about why Bluesky didn't use it a little bit later in the talk. Okay, so 2019, Jack Dorsey announces Bluesky. A matrix channel is formed for a bunch of technologists to get together and start talking about it. Jay is one of the people that joins in. But not much happens very quickly because there was just not a lot of agreement about which of those tech trees to go down or which specific technology to use. There was disagreement about requirements, things like that. So it was a challenging kind of effort at that stage without any clear leader to help to parse through the decisions. In 2021, Jay's eventually chosen to lead Bluesky, and she negotiates for us to operate as an independent organization, a public benefit LLC, which later became a public benefit corporation as it is now. And we were essentially contractors to Twitter, and that was the nature of the relationship. We were contractors providing, implementing a new technology for them to potentially adopt, and instructing them on how to do it. Okay, deep breath, because this is when things actually start. The decade of Bluesky between 2022 and 2025. So at a high level, I would break down the timeline as this, that in 2022, we got most of that year to do R&D on the protocol. 2023, we are live with the private beta, focusing very hard on getting federation finished before we actually opened up the network. It was very important to us that we did that. And working on the scaling infrastructure for it, because it was a giant Postgres for a while, and sadly that doesn't work very long when it comes to social. And then in 2024, we publicly launched. So that's your high-level description of those 3 years. Now I want to talk about the approach that we took as we were working on the technology, how we thought about it, both from the requirement side, but also from the kind of philosophy side. So we'll start with the requirements. The way we saw it, we needed to make sure that we attack scale in the way that we expect, the average person expects out of a social network. Social networks are very large public spaces. You need to be able to have millions and millions of people at least able to find each other or experience some part of their social activity as you all kind of discover inside of algorithms and things like that. That is kind of right from the get-go, we said we cannot choose a technology or build a technology that doesn't hit those scale requirements. This is a hard requirement. It also needs to be very consumer friendly in the sense that it can't be complicated to use. We don't want to have to explain to people like what a wallet is, or here's your paper key, or have cryptographic identifiers showing up inside of the UI. These things scare people away. I think the worst thing that we did to folks is make them have to understand DNS. So there was one time we were explaining DNS to Flavor Flav, and I felt he's an old man. It wasn't kind. Feel bad about that still. Moderation needs to work as well. Kind of feels like an obvious statement, but certainly in the decentralization world, moderation was not always at the top of mind in the design, and it was very important that we had an effective model for that. And finally, it needs to be locked open. We need to be able to put into it guarantees to ensure that no one company can continue to own this in future, that there's freedom to move between providers. We also had some principles, some design principles that we wrote down and talked a lot about as we were working. The first one is no steps backwards. That one has to do with the usability in many ways. It had become a real habit, certainly for me, working on decentralization technologies, to say things like, oh, well, the fact that you have these other great properties, like the ability to edit the source code from your device and change it that way, and you could fork a website, that's a cool thing that makes the problems okay. The problems are not okay. You can't take steps backwards in the expectations of what these applications should feel like, only steps forwards. We're building new technology, it should be good, right? What is your theory of change? Oh, you know what, I just realized that I actually have a per slide thing for this, so I'll just, yeah, right, there you go. Some more of the kind of things that you can't get away with. Installing a desktop application, that's one of them. It's a social network, you should be able to just go to a website, things like that. So, I'm gonna keep moving actually. So, theory of change. If you're pursuing a mission, how do you intend to succeed? This had to do a lot with our decision making about how we organize and how we attack the problem in terms of making a product and going into the market. We have to think of you're building a new technology, you want to get it to everybody's hands. What is your strategy for making sure that the world is going to have access to this technology? With software, it's essentially the product market. So we need to be successful in the product market and build a competitive product. Build protocol with application. This one really matters. I certainly had a habit with my previous projects to isolate protocol development from the application. Two separate teams, didn't talk a whole lot. Maybe they'd be you'd get some tickets launched across the barrier every once in a while, but we would frequently lose sight of the actual practical needs of the application, and the application devs would be consistently blocked on just basic things that they're trying to accomplish. So even before we knew we were going to be building a an actual social network and deploying it, which we didn't originally know, we did know that we would build a reference client to help inform the development side of things and also to help educate people on how to use the technology. I would strongly recommend the same for anybody else working on new protocols. Finally, this is something that's in our corporate culture doc. The company is a future adversary. There's a pretty clear cycle that happens with every major tech company of idealism to market capture to overgrowth and then finally the enshittification stage. And so you have to ask, okay, if you can't break that institutional cycle, can you create a meta system that can withstand it and move on to other healthier organizations that crop up in the future? So you build in preparation for stage 4. So what did we end up building? We came from P2P and we had this big idea, hey, what if we did P2P on servers? So I think I'm just going to call that server to server. The logic of this was that the techniques that we use the techniques that we use at peer-to-peer are actually quite focused on abstracting away individual devices and turning the different hosting servers into, I'm going to use the word fungible items inside of the network. They no longer have privacy. So content addressing instead of location addressing, and you're no longer bound to a host. That's giving one important property that was in our initial requirements, which is that you can migrate your account around, right? Because it's no longer about which server you're on. Meanwhile, the servers are able to handle scale and reliability, so you can use largely traditional techniques, which we do try to use all the time in how we've architected the inside of our data center. But you're still using servers, so you're not getting stuck in device sync issues, you're not getting stuck in availability issues. It's very clear on how to use the technology. So that was the logic that we had as we walked into working on the protocol. It was not a direct path to where we are. Here are some of the things that we looked at and then ended up discarding. We spent a little bit of time on zero knowledge proofs. I think I bear some blame for that. What if you could, what if you could prove that 10,000 people liked it? Yeah, that wasn't good. PLC actually took months of research to come to. I read every DID spec out there. And ultimately, what we have now was the conclusion of, look, this is the only thing that satisfies the requirements. I think we'll probably hear more about where we think that can go later. Lexicon was, for a time, an RDF-based system. If I had more time, it might have stayed RDF-based, but we ended up getting... I'm getting reactions over here, so... I think I could have made it work, but I didn't have time. And then all the way up until like August of 2022, we were doing client-side keys. It actually took us some time to decide, you know what, we could put the keys on the server. We had to come up with a mechanism that we felt would still enable adversarial migration, which I think probably is more than I could talk about right now. But so we were preparing transactions in the client and sending it up to the server, and I'm actually really glad that we chose to go ahead and let key management happen in the server because it improved the DX significantly. But that was right up until August that we were doing that. So what is it exactly? This is something we've all had to engage with at various points. Is it federation, server to server, open microservices, a data web? Sometimes it's a little bit hard to describe exactly what kind of technology Proto is. But I'm going to go back to my framework of publishing versus distribution. Publishing is handled by the PDS. You're publishing JSON records essentially. And those are inside of your data repository. Your keys are also managed inside of the PDS. And then there's the distribution side, which is the app view. And the app view aggregates it together and applies business logic for the application. This is actually somewhat similar to the model of the web, where the PDS is the equivalent of a website, and the app view is the equivalent of a search engine. So these are the two different sides, and if you're trying to control distribution, you want to run an app view. If you're trying to have ownership of the publishing, you want to run a PDS. That's the logic of it. I do think it's important that I mention why we chose not to use ActivityPub. We gave it a very close look. I spent about 2 weeks writing a pretty deep research write-up on what we thought, whether or not this was a feasible approach. Ultimately, it came down to the identity matter that Blaine very effectively summed up. We were concerned about the issue with account migration. We also felt like this was, thank you. We also felt like this was actually directly related to why the account sign up was difficult for the ActivityPub world, because you're pretty bought in after you make that choice. Whenever you sign up on a server, that's the choice that you've made. Migration is, they have a form of migration, but it's lossy. And so our logic is, well, look, if you can migrate freely, then we can guiltlessly have you get onto our system first, and then once you learn about that choice and you have an opinion about going somewhere else, you can just make the change. So it was an important usability decision, actually. But the really major thing was that scale requires aggregation. You're going to need to pull together the content from a wide view of the network. And the ActivityPub world really doesn't like that premise, or at least historically has not. I don't know if they're moving on this, but especially at the time, that was not really something they were receptive to. So that was a pretty hard blocker, and we felt like it would not really be a great idea to try to push through those ideas, given that that community was pretty clear on what they wanted. So we ended up going a different direction. Okay, here's a little thing for you. This was the first build. We did not have images yet. We had, you see that thing over there? Your post is trending with Bluesky OGs. So that is going to cause PTSD for everybody in the Bluesky team. That was a feature called Scenes, where it was like our hacked together version of community. And the idea was if, like, you know, 2/3 of the people inside of a little group liked your post, it was officially trending and it would get reposted automatically. And people were like, how do I post to it? And we're like, oh, right. You can't. And nobody understood that at all, reasonably. So we had to rip that out. Upvotes and downvotes, that was originally one of the ideas, not in there now. So yeah, there it is. It was pretty funny when we actually got images in after, I don't know, like a month of working on the private beta and going, wow, that really makes a difference. Big breakthrough there. Okay, so that's the history. And it brings us to here. And now let's talk about the future. So on the protocol roadmap, we've got a lot of things that are being actively worked on. Some of this is actually either like has happened or is on the verge of happening. And then there's some other things that are a little bit further in the future. The main thing that we're thinking about as we're working on it is, like, can we get out of the way of the application developers? We're so close. It's so close to being actually quite convenient to build applications. There's just a number of pieces that we got to round out to get out of y'all's way. And thankfully, we're really quite focused on that in the protocol team as we're moving really quickly. The world of OAuth is coming soon. It is really quite close to being ready. And in fact, quite a bit of it is already available to play with. We've almost, I believe, got it so that I'm going to see if I can. You can create accounts on the Bluesky infrastructure using OAuth. That's one that has been a bit of a blocker. So that's, I think, like very close. But there's, it's going to include tools that the PDS provide, third-party apps to build, to create accounts on the Bluesky, as I mentioned. Way cleaner sign-in flows, no more app passwords. Hooray. But also proper permissioning, which is so important for things. It's dangerous to keep playing around and not have permissioning in the system. So the OAuth scopes proposal was recently shared. I recommend everybody take a look at it and, you know, flag things now. Definitely is a good time to do that. Lexicon distribution, there's a lot of fun things happening here. We sometimes shorthand this as LexHub, and you'll see why in a second. But lexicons can now get published on @proto. There is a spec for how to do this. Consequently, there's now a way to fetch a lexicon definition from the protocol. It works as records published in @proto repos. And what's interesting about that is that it opens up using the @protocol application model to create essentially what function like registries. And that's the LexHub idea. So you can have services that aggregate together all the different lexicons that are getting published and give a nice user experience for fetching them into your application, and then also being able to create web interfaces for browsing around, looking at them, things like that. So that is something I'm actually really pleased about, because you're getting decentralized publishing, as is always the goal, but also the kind of nice UX affordances that you would expect out of a traditional service. So Hopefully that'll be help for everybody that's starting to work on their applications to be able to start to see what lexicons are out there and get documentation and easy kind of install flows into the applications. All right, this one's something I know that's on a lot of people's minds. I don't have anything terribly specific to share, except that it is something that we're very aware of and thinking quite a bit about, and I think there's going to be a number of conversations about this. I know some folks have been cooking on their ideas about how privately shared data should work. Privately shared data, specifically what we're talking about, is data that it's not public, it's private, but you're sharing it with some people. And what are the mechanisms for that going to be on the protocol? It's pretty important that we find something good for this. Even our team is blocked on this. This is why we don't have bookmarks, sorry. So this is pretty important that we start to find some answers to this, and I expect that we will start to engage in it pretty heavily at some point in this year. If I had to guess, maybe by the end of summer. End-to-end encryption for messaging. This is also something where there's interesting things happening actually outside of the ad protocol ecosystem, which is really quite exciting for us. And that is the MLS standard, which has been championed at the IETF. I think we actually have a number of people that are involved in that here, or at least one person I spoke to. Yeah, there he is. Richard, right? Yep, so everybody mob Richard later. So there has just been a really great amount of interest in MLS lately across a lot of different technology stacks, including the web. I think that we can look at that with some optimism that it might be able to really accelerate the end-to-end encryption future for the ad proto. Another thing that is very much on our mind is practical decentralization. How do we make sure that we are continuing to push towards there being other operators in the app protocol for applications like Bluesky? There's some areas that need work on this. I think I've got these as individual slides. So cost reduction. We did make some progress. Actually, I think this is close to releasing. Sync 1.1, this means that we no longer have to maintain full archives whenever you're running a relay. It makes running relays dramatically cheaper and more scalable. So relays are cheaper. Now, what about the app views? There's a general question that we've been asking, which is how can we get to a point where a $100 a month droplet is able to actually run a meaningful Bluesky experience so that there's a better cost gradient, right? People, right now, if you're trying to run the Bluesky application, you're doing a full network sync, which just costs more money than a lot of the folks that are interested in trying this out can put up front. It makes it a bigger decision. So is there a way to address that? And we've started to play around with essentially partial syncs of the network. This is actually pretty similar to SSB for the SSB heads out there. The idea is that you're going to sync people primarily based on the follow graph of your local users. And then you'll do expansions out on that graph to kind of like give them a wider view of the network. Every user has what I would consider the ideal sync set, which essentially is the idea that if the server did not sync everything, but it synced what you were interested in, you wouldn't notice that the server is doing that. The example that I like to give is that there are a lot of Japanese users. I never come across their activity, but I know they're there, right? So if I was on an instance that wasn't syncing the Japan cluster, that'd be okay from my usability perspective. That would be a cost reduction, right? So is there a way that we could build a sync engine which is smarter and reduces costs for operation? This is something that we're pretty keen to try to drive forward. We want to have some conversations about this. In fact, there's a session option, I believe, to talk about this. I think is it called, Brian, is it called IndieSky? IndieSky. Yeah, so if you're into talking about this idea, we would love to have that conversation, so give that session a +1 so that we can start to press on this practical decentralization matter, which I think is quite important to improve the resiliency of this thing. Yeah, here's another one that's really important for practical decentralization, is that we put all that work on the technology side of account migration, but the UX is not quite there. So this is just a matter of scheduling some work, to be honest. But these are the two things that need to happen. We need to get to the point where we're comfortable with inbound migrations. Right now, you can only migrate away from our servers. And And then we need to start to cook up a UX that is not a command line for doing the migration, but actually is in the application and has a nice clean flow with appropriate education along the way so that you don't get tricked. Finally, PLC governance. We are working on moving PLC to an independent legal entity. And we think that's really quite important to ensuring that that remains governed in a neutral fashion. There's some technological improvements that we think could also be put in place. Audit logs for external monitoring, the same kind of principle that certificate transparency uses, which would enable mirrors to do full syncs of the thing and essentially keep the core registry honest and possibly even serve responses instead of always going to the core registry every time. So what does the future hold? Let's do a little wish casting or hope casting for the future. A world where the protocol stabilizes with standards bodies, we got PLC under stable external control, Bluesky becomes one of many as multiple mainstream applications emerge, and for each mainstream app, there's 10 plus self-hosteds running, and that we all get to spend our time arguing about schemas instead of worrying about the rest. And that's my talk. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Paul. If we have any questions, if folks could form a line right here. Who wants to come up first? Richard.
Thanks for the talk, Paul. Thanks for the MLS shout out. It's technology close to my heart. In terms of the Bluesky organization focus, you know, there's Bluesky the app, there's ATproto. Where would you say kind of the long-term focus of the organization is? Is it going to be the Bluesky company? Is it going to be the ATproto company, or something in the middle?
I mean, it's hard to give a perfect prediction of how that'll land. It'll depend a lot on what the kind of environment looks like. I think it's likely to expect that the Bluesky company will always continue to steward the Bluesky application. We also expect that over time, you know, that protocol will go under standards governance, and so I would expect the Bluesky company to have a R&D department, which is involved in helping to, you know, be a part of that. So I would expect both. One never knows, but yeah, that would be my expectation.
Hey, so you mentioned that you know, the app was developed alongside the protocol, right? And that was a very tightly knit sort of development function. What is your thoughts on the philosophy of like abstracting that protocol and enabling sort of different lexicons, different sort of implementations of the whole system? Like, what's the organization's philosophy of supporting the community in that? Like, there's some interesting things happening with Rust, with Go implementations that sort of don't quite fit together super nicely right yet. And so what's the philosophy on that coordination?
So you're asking, actually, could you hold on to the mic? I want to clarify. Yeah, so you're asking about, like, as other applications are coming along, how do we, since we have focused on one application ourselves, how are we going to help along other applications?
Yeah, how are you supporting that sort of abstraction of the protocol to meet the sort of various use cases that will pop up around it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the protocol, while we did focus on one particular application as we went, we also did keep it generic to other applications. So hopefully all the pieces are in the proper place. And the intent would be that we sort of prove out those mechanisms with the application and then can share, you know, okay, so this is how you do blank and this is how you do blank, right? And that's like what's kind of embedded in the notion of like the whole lexicon system. Like here's how you publish your schemas, here's how you structure an app view to, you know, begin to build business logic on top of it. So it should be repeatable, what we've done with the application side. And in general, we're pretty careful to make sure that when we do something, when we need something in our application, which is a protocol concern, that we design that in the protocol both for us and for others. So actually, a good example of that is why we're starting to look at the BFF model, which is an interesting conversation. I don't want to overemphasize this, but there are currently the PDSs have some baked-in knowledge about the Bluesky schemas because you need a read after write guarantee. Or we don't want that to stay that way because that's not thinking about other applications. So moving to what we're doing with OAuth ends up resolving that in a generic way. Yeah.
I have two questions, totally unrelated. I'll ask them together. First one is just tactical. I saw a slide saying that something, I don't remember exactly what it was, is a good candidate for a community project.
Yeah.
And maybe you already have this and I missed it. Do you have a more of a formal way to like have a list of sort of, I don't know, call them RFPs or things that you would love other people to do so that you don't have to, and at the same time signaling you're not going to do it, so you're not going to be eating the lunch of somebody who does do it?
Yeah, there actually is a blog post. No, it's a GitHub discussion that Brian Newbold put up that actually lays that out exactly. Brian, where are you, Brian? Is it called the Call for Projects? Is that the? Okay, we'll share it later. But yeah, I think if you Google Call for Projects at Proto, you probably find it.
Second question. So you mentioned ActivityPub, and three things you mentioned: ActivityPub, and then private data, and then the efficiency of. You mentioned language is a good potential way to partition.
Oh, sure.
For scaling.
Yeah.
So my question is, did you consider at all ActivityPub as a solution for private data, given a good partitioning scheme like around some tuple of language and things of that nature?
So that's So essentially, that's as we talked about, as I mentioned, we're beginning to engage with the question of how we're going to do selectively shared private shared data. I don't know. I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility that we look at ActivityPub for it, but there are some pretty big semantic mismatches there. It would be kind of stapling together two different protocols in a way that, like, it'd be, this is where it would have been nice if we had gone with RDF, right? And it did end up using their schema language. But since we didn't, then it starts to become pretty kludgy to go in that direction, so it's not really where I would take it personally. Yeah.
Hi, I was really curious about the 2,000 pixel image resolution limit and kind of where that comes from. Is it like a per PDS thing? Like if somebody were to run their own PDS that could support larger images, will other app views just work with that, or like?
Yeah. So where the current limit is now, I would say that we chose something at some point and ran with it. But there's an interesting question embedded in there, which is the kind of consensus of constraints. If PDS starts publishing higher resolution images, would that work? And actually, the lexicon is designed to be a toolkit for helping to figure out what other people are doing, right? It's not the rules. It's not hard and fast. You can actually use that proto without really using lexicon, but it's designed to tell you what to expect. And so I believe that when it comes to images, we actually do include constraints in the image definition of, like, here's what the max size is, here's what the max width and the max height is. And so to some degree, it's a matter of actually talking to whichever application and finding out what they'll do. But the lexicon is a guide for that expectation. So let's see what you got there. Of course, Retroid. I'm going to just read this. Retroid says, in practice, you can upload larger images to a custom PDS, but our CDN downscales them to 2,000 pixels. Thank you, Retroid.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for talking to us. You mentioned Lex Hub. You mentioned inbound account migration and other mainstream apps. I'm assuming, or if you would like to elaborate, other mainstream apps being other apps with their own PDS, potentially their own lexicon, if they're doing video, shameless plug, their own CDN, etc. I'm curious what yours or Bluesky's views are on interoperability in terms of inbound interoperability, say potentially longer videos on other mainstream apps that are kind of sharing the costs in that they're hosting their own infrastructure that might allow them to say have longer videos, which is more costly on them, but it means Bluesky isn't fronting that, and Bluesky lasts longer and forever. Yes, Spark Social. You know,
Oh,
we're trying
yeah,
to do
hey.
social video. Hey, how
I
you
saw your thing
going?
recently.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yes. You reposted us. Thank you very much.
Of course. Yeah. So that will always be a somewhat interesting question. And again, when it comes to like consensus between organizations, it devolves down to the peer-wise conversations, right? That said, the way to probably look at this is there's what we're doing with our infrastructure and what we can afford and what we're like what we think is like good for integrating into our application. So this also applies to like if somebody creates a schema that is in their application and they're looking to have it kind of show up inside the Bluesky application like as a special kind of embed card, that kind of thing. We're like, okay, cool. Like talk to us about it, show us what you got, and we'll like look at introducing support. With video, like right now, I know a number of folks are playing with, essentially repurposing the existing Bluesky posts as a, and emphasizing the video part of it instead of the post, which is totally cool. If you're trying to go for something which is larger than like what we can handle, you're probably just going to need to set up your own lexicon and use your own CDN and go beyond those limits, which means you lose the intercompatibility on those particular posts, but we have to kind of operate within what makes sense for our company and the nature of our product.
Hey, thank you for that wonderful talk, taking us from old internet to new internet and talking about what you're trying to do to improve new internet. I have a couple of old internet made new concerns. One's a little whimsical, one's a little security oriented. The security oriented one first. Could we possibly start to strip EXIF location data from photos, or at least make that a good default? There's something uniquely terrifying about having a real-time WebSocket stream that includes the location of every photo posted to it. That would be nice. The lighthearted one is, could we possibly get SVG support sometime? They're way smaller, easier on the bandwidth, really flexible for animations. Could be very cool.
All right. I mean, I'll take a look at SVG. I believe we are currently, that our client currently strips the EXIF data. Is that not accurate?
I am raising the concern. If you're already aware of it and doing it, I'm very happy.
Yeah, I believe we are, and I would hope that the other clients are as well.
Would that be true for video as well as just images?
Jazz, are you in here? I don't see Jazz.
We can find out in post.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about it later. Yeah.
Find him.
If you're already doing it, thank you so much for already being ahead of the game, because we do not want to be a couple of years down this darkest timeline and have that.
Completely. Yeah.
Saludos, Paul. Building off of the end of your talk, I'm going to be a terrible person, and I'm going to open a can of worms preemptively. Do you have a lay of the land, too long didn't read, of what maybe private accounts would look like? I'm sure that will be touched upon later. And I'm pinning you now, so good luck.
I straight up don't know. We're gonna the private shared data system. It's gonna depend a whole lot on the properties of that design. We do not yet know what that design is going to look like. When you start to have non-public data, there's a lot of the assumptions of the system that start to change. Having the selectively shared data show up in feeds, for instance, becomes unlikely unless you include the feed generator in the perimeter of who's allowed to see the post. But beyond that, the UX that Twitter had of being able to flip a switch and turn your entire account private doesn't work if you don't have an oracle that is making that determination on every request. At best, what we could do is nuke all of your posts and recreate them in the private form, but that would not be very successful. So we're going to have to work around the technology in the UX and make sure that the two are reflective of each other, and it probably just won't look like how Twitter did it.
Okay, and last question with me.
Hey, Paul. Samer here from Fedica. Question about the relationship with the developer community. I mean, this is great. It's probably the first time I see this. But is there any way or plan to have like DevRel team? Like for me currently, like I email, Emily, Brian, Jazz directly, or go on a Discord channel, ask questions which sometimes don't get answered. So is there any plan you guys have to have like stronger support with the developer community?
So yeah, right now they put on their DevRel hat, and then that's the DevRel team, and then they put on their other hat. Yes, we do intend to build out a DevRel team over time. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, everybody.